The dark pathology of stand-up comedy. Stand-up comedy and slam poetry are equally bad and should be eradicated from existence. Part 1. Psychopathology in stand-up comedy. Stand-up comedy is the most solitary performing art. Picture a lone wolf stand-up comic looking at himself in the mirror and saying the same few phrases over and over, tinkering with the emphasis on the syllables. Comedians speak the same words until they become meaningless, until the words reach what is known as semantic satiation. Like in Tommy Boy, where Chris Farley and David Spade keep saying the word road repeatedly until it becomes an unfamiliar sound.
It's got all those robes on it. Rogues? Rudes? I can't say that word.
Roads. Rows.
Rowards. That's a total weird word, isn't it?
That is a freaky word, man.
There's something unsettling that you cannot unsee when you conceptualize the stand-up comedian as entirely self-absorbed, in the act of trying to make a prepared speech come off like a spontaneous rant. I have come to believe that the stand-up comic is a specific variety of a psychopath. Comics have the characteristic glib charm. The typical comic basks in an audience's applause, yet they are not comfortable in crowds. The comic hates crowds, but also needs approval. Even in a world teeming with parasocial relationships, one-way relationships, the relationship between a stand-up comic and a crowd is vampiric.
Beware those who seek constant crowds, for they are nothing alone.
The psychological profile of stand-up comedians is more interesting than the art form itself. I rarely watch stand-up, but when I do, I don't find it funny. I do enjoy radio and podcasts, though, and I have noticed a few interesting patterns within the relatively small sample size of working comedians. I started to get lost in this corridor of thought when I rediscovered a lecture by two Canadian academics who study psychopathy. These academics wrote a paper called Hungry Like the Wolf that got a fair amount of media attention in the early 2010s because they found that when studying the language of psychopaths, that psychopaths used much more language centered on instrumental or primary needs compared to non-psychopaths. At time code 13 minutes 23 seconds, researcher Jeff Hancock explains the central finding.
And so psychopaths talked a lot about what they ate that day, which is one of the reasons that we named the paper Hungry Like the Wolf. Because it was one of the biggest effects was when we asked them to describe their murder, they talked a lot about what they ate that day. What they drank that day was also more frequent in the psychopathic language than the non-psychopathic. They talked about money more often.
When I started to think about the pathology of stand-up comedy, this seemed immediately relevant because this finding seemed to mirror the subject matter of stand-up comedy. Think to yourself about all the bits you remember from your favorite stand-up comedian. How many of the bits you remember have something to do with an instrumental need, like food or money? How many are about something more abstract, like love or religion or a higher purpose? Feel free to marinate on this. We will return to it in time. Part 2, the evolution of stand-up comedy. Stand-up comedy comes from the minstrel show of the traveling burlesque and then vaudeville eras of entertainment during the post-Civil War era. The earliest forms of stand-up comedy were all about goofing on black people. Stand-up comedy comes from the same roots as blackface comedy and the Jim Crow character, which was so ubiquitous that it lent its name and toxic legacy to Jim Crow laws, which were laws used to segregate and discriminate against black people. In a 2014 series on the history of stand-up comedy, Slate magazine spoke with historian Joseph Boskin, who described the subject matter of the typical vaudeville act that was a progenitor of stand-up comedy. The pie in the face, the female chase, problems of money, gold-digging wives and harping mothers-in-law, the salacious, unobtainable woman, and the defiance of authority. Then, as in now, poking fun at the powers that be was especially popular. Boskin notes vaudeville shows often climaxed in a courtroom, with prisoners and lawyers squirting water at each other from seltzer bottles and the judge demanding order with a wooden potato masher. It's worth taking a quick mental inventory of how the topics of the humor of vaudeville fit in with my hungry like a wolf hypothesis that comedians are all psychopaths. The pie in the face or the seltzer in the face gag was the punchline to half of all slapstick routines. Stand-up grew out of the body world of the dance teases of burlesque and the imagery of the blackface performer devouring chicken and watermelon. Stand-up was born of necessity, in art from adversity. Minstrel shows were the cheapest form of entertainment after the Civil War, and the stand-up began as a way to keep the audience occupied in between the striptease and the body skits. The stand-up comic requires only one employee, which is a lot cheaper than a troupe of actors portraying black people as senseless kooks who walked around like they were auditioning for the Ministry of Silly Walks. The blackface Jim Crow character endured in Hollywood well into the 20th century. The dark id, the primitive associations of the American mind, largely evolved from the burlesque and vaudeville acts. This grab bag of symbols and characters became part of the permanent cultural background radiation when it was immortalized in the early cartoons of the moving picture era. The old burlesque performances of Jim Crow and the minstrel shows became Disney cartoons. The vilest image of the Jim Crow era has been sanitized from the Disney catalog, but a light snowfall of bits and pieces of the racial psychographic heritage is still being deposited in the cultural aether onto modern Americans as we move further into the aftermath of the nuclear destruction of our shared legacy of slavery. Part 3. The Dark Pathology of the Sad Clown. One of the germs of this piece was something that the late, great Norm Macdonald said. Norm was talking about Vince Champ, who is a good-looking, wholesome comic who was coming up in the 90s along with Norm. Champ was a clean comic who never swore on stage. Norm was always struck that it was somebody with the personality of Champ who turned out to be a serial rapist. Police pieced together the case against Champ because women kept getting raped on college campuses where Champ was performing his stand-up routine. The duality and juxtaposition of a clean comic becoming a serial rapist is a window into how human beings have many masks, and we each contain multitudes. Vince Champ's story also makes me think of Bill Cosby, and how Cosby was also famously inoffensive and wholesome in his pretend life as a sitcom dad or as a stand-up comedian, while being a monster in real life. Outside of somebody like Norm Macdonald, who I find to be the rare stand-up comic who talked about loftier subjects, you don't hear anyone talking about Vince Champ anymore. It touches a tender area of the soft white underbelly of the human experience. We don't want to think too deeply about how disingenuous humans can be. It's always been interesting to me the way that no one felt allowed to talk about Bill Cosby's serial rapes until stand-up comedian Hannibal Buress made a random throwaway joke about it on stage that was captured furtively by somebody bootlegging a stand-up comedy show. The truth about America's dad had to leak out onto the internet, and it had to be spoken by another black man, and there were these prerequisites that needed to be met before anybody felt okay talking about how Bill Cosby drugged and raped scores of women. Not even his victims felt like they had any space to say anything, apparently. Vince Champ would have been an enormous star if he wasn't a convicted serial rapist. He won Star Search in 1992. With his clean-cut image, he may have been the next big sitcom star like Cosby. I found a 1990 episode of Match Game co-starring Vince Champ, along with all the typical panelists, like Charles Nelson Riley and Sally Struthers, on the Internet Archive. It's a regular laugh riot, let me tell you folks. Within the first minute and a half, we get a terrible Fred Travellina impression of George H.W. Bush. The bit is that Poppy Bush is sending Donald Trump to Russia as an economic advisor. It's a little too on the nose. Here's the clip, and notice how funny the audience seems to find the idea of Donald Trump as an economic advisor.
We have welcome Fred Travellina, who we have to announce, just was the opening act for the economic summit with George Bush.
The Russians want money. I said, no way, but I promised them an economic advisor, and Donald Trump left this morning. It'll be in
All right, good to have the president here. Let's meet our contestant, Ingrid. Hi, how are you?
Holy fuck, I am so sidetracked watching the Match Game. At 3 minutes and 5 seconds in, the host of the show, Ross Schaefer, makes a joke about paying the woman contestant on the show to see her breasts that would get him fired and then run through a social media wood chipper if that clip somehow aired on television today.
They have their answer. Susie said my plastic surgeon goofed. Instead of using silicone, he used silly putty. And now I can tie my
breasts.
Breasts and I'd pay $5 to see that. Fred.
Yes.
It was so casually tossed off that it gave me a little jolt of transgressive glee. The grainy quality and the risque content gave it the feel of a genuine discovery, like I had just found a 1990 episode of The Match Game inside an ancient scroll that's been buried in a salt mine for millennia. Just after 7 minutes in, the first time we've heard from Vince Champ in maybe the entire show, he's asked to say which animal Roseanne Barr most resembles, and he selects cow.
I feel bad too, and I don't even know Roseanne, and I feel bad, but I thought, well, body double, I thought I'd probably go with cow too.
You said cow also.
Yeah. 2 cows in a row.
The other panelists seem pretty boozed up, but Vince is sort of boring and not much else so far. Here's where I need to jerk the wheel and take a quick detour so I can talk to you about another half-baked cultural hypothesis I have that I'll present with the aid of some lists. I communicate in lists. There is a distinct intertidal zone of culture that existed between the 80s and the 90s. It's the 20th century American pop culture version of the state of Jefferson, which is a proposed new state on the west coast of the contiguous United States that would combine Northern California and Southern Oregon. NorCal and the southernmost part of Oregon, like Ashland and Eureka, are much more like each other than the big city parts of their own states, like Portland, Los Angeles, and San Diego. In the same way, there is something distinct that was happening from roughly 1988 to 1992. From 1988 to 1992, the vibe I have in my head is that the popular movies were character studies or thrillers or mid-budget drama. It was an era of strong directorial vision, as this was also the dawn of avid video editing software. The barrier to entry to be an independent filmmaker was becoming more manageable. Just a small list of the kinds of films I would identify with this interstitial era. Single White Female, 1992. The Crying Game, 1992. Singles, 1992. Far and Away, 1992. Reservoir Dogs, 1992. Fried Green Tomatoes, 1991. Sleeping with the Enemy, 1991. The Prince of Tides, 1991. Misery, 1990. Slacker, 1990. Do the Right Thing, 1989. When Harry Met Sally, 1989. Sex, Lies, and Videotape, 1989. Rain Man, 1988. Die Hard, 1988. It's the era of classic Seinfeld. It's the prime zone in a long stretch of relevance for the mullet. The late 70s and early 80s is the disco/synthwave era. The mid-80s are the Morning in America/consumerism boom, with the attendant hair metal symbology of craven excess. The late 80s and early 90s marks the coming of age for Gen X, and there is a really interesting punk and DIY-fueled rise in independent media and the rise of alternative rock, grunge, and zine culture that touched many subcultures like skateboarding, for example, and ended up in a mini renaissance of film and music before everything got blown up or disrupted by the internet. The borders could even be a little fuzzier, and you could say the late 80s and early 90s ended when Kurt Cobain was murdered in April 1994, but things had already changed into the mid-1990s technocracy of the Clinton years. To me, the other real bookend is the release of Jurassic Park in the summer of 1993. That film was such a money geyser that studios were tripping over themselves to lock up franchises that could print millions of dollars. The effects of the watershed of Jurassic Park are still being felt today, with a studio system that has completely ignored smart, adult-oriented mid-budget movies. It's all cheap horror films or comic book trash in one form or another from 93 to infinity, basically. Part 4. The abusive relationship between comedians and their fan bases. The Fighter and the Kid subreddit and several other subreddits roughly aligned to the Joe Rogan verse have a long-running joke or series of memes about how Joe Rogan and his comic buddies mythologize their role as comedians. According to Rogan, there are only about 1,000 stand-up comics in the world, and together they form a Captain Planet-like group of comic book superheroes. Rogan and his wealthy comedian friends bloviate about how they are modern philosophers and the last line of defense in the culture war. Inevitably, this self-congratulatory circle-jerking amongst comics has led to an insurgent backlash. The transition of many comedians to doing regular podcasts has sped up this contempt and the audience souring on stand-up comics. The pandemic suffocated the business of stand-up like it did so many other things. Overfamiliarity has bred contempt, and it is easier than ever to imagine a world without stand-up comedy. If it exists in 25 years, I predict it will be as a curiosity. After all, there are still people out there tap dancing, reciting slam poetry, and doing one-man plays and dance quintets at Crane Jackson's Fountain Street Theater on a Tuesday night.
Dude.
Hey, Marty.
Dude, I finally got the venue I wanted. I'm performing my dance quintet, my cycle, at Crane Jackson's Fountain Street Theater on Tuesday night, and I'd love it if you came and gave me notes.
I'll be there, man.
Dude, tomorrow's already the 10th.
Far out. Oh, all right, okay.
Just slip the rent under my door.
Stand-up is a genre of one-person show, and anyone who puts on a one-man or one-woman show is telegraphing to the world that they think they can portray all the characters in an ensemble. It really is a sort of hubris, what we are talking about when we talk about stand-up comedy. Or one-man plays. You must be entirely self-involved to think that a group of people should all stop what they're doing, take time out of their day to travel to a specific place at a specific time, and then watch you play all the parts in a play for hours. Can you imagine wanting to pay your hard-earned cash to watch some asshole reenact Star Wars all by himself, complete with all the robot noises? Imagine having the hubris to think that you, personally, are more entertaining than a multi-billion-dollar behemoth of a franchise fucking Star fucking Wars. Yes, there is a guy who made a living doing Star Wars as a one-man play, and it was officially licensed by Lucasfilm. The douche even did the droid noises poorly, like a Kirkland signature brand Michael Winslow. You may remember Michael Winslow from the Police Academy films or the film Spaceballs, which, unlike stand-up comedy, is actually funny.
I'm having trouble with the radar, sir.
What's wrong with it?
I've lost the bleeps, I've lost the sweeps, and I've lost the creeps.
The what? The what? And the what?
You know, the bleeps, the sweeps, and the creeps.
That's not all he's lost.
I have been interested in fan communities for a long time. One of the first open revolts of a fan community that I remember being intimately aware of involved the Opie and Anthony radio show. Opie and Anthony was a shock jock radio show that featured a rotating cast of the best stand-up comedians in New York City and beyond. It eventually established a legendary reputation as a show with a unique hangout vibe, which involved audience participation. The fans were known as pests, and the pests congregated on message boards in the late 90s and early 2000s as O&A got popular. The names of the message boards and websites associated with the show are illustrative: fullblownaids.com and eatabullet.com. The pests became infamous for staging an insurgency against the mainstream press in New York City. The surprisingly thorough and mostly accurate Wikipedia entry on O&A includes a section on the pests and the Assault on the Media campaign, as it was dubbed, where O&A fans found a way to insert signs and scream slogans on live TV broadcasts. The show also weaponized their loyal audience by sicking the pests on other radio shows in a yearly attack on hack or normie radio called Jocktober. The producers... Oh no, the fucking cops are coming. Better hide all the drugs. Son of a bitch. Somebody's dying, gonna fuck up my podcast. You cunts. I don't even know where I am now. Fuck. The producers of O&A would look around the country to find what they deemed the lamest shows on radio. Typically, they would target the morning zoo-type shows that were still limping along with the same formula that was big in the 80s. Then the pests would descend on the Facebook page and any other website or social media associated with the radio show that they were bashing. Opie and Anthony would delight on air at the panic and confusion that would result from all of the weird inside O&A references and offensive language and imagery that would suddenly flood the podunk radio station's web presence. All this long wind-up was necessary to explain that when co-host Anthony Cumia was fired close to 10 years ago now, in July 2014, for a racist and violent Twitter outburst, the pests went rogue. The chickens came home to roost. The entire downfall is cataloged online in places, but in essence, the pests came to hate all the key members of the Opie and Anthony show, and several watered-down successor shows have limped along for the last decade, each a bigger disappointment than the last. If you have a spare 8 hours and change, you can listen to part 1 of the YouTube supercut of the dissolution of the O&A show. Of all the great comics that appeared on the Opie and Anthony show, nice endings have been hard to find. Besides all the comedians who appeared on the golden age of the show, it's worth noting that when Anthony got fired, his co-host Opie eventually got demoted to do his own afternoon show on SiriusXM, and of the 3 regular comics he had on the Opie show, or whatever it was called, 2 died early deaths, and the 3rd was last seen in a disturbing clip where he was homeless and having a mental health episode. Looking at the broader sample of comics that appeared regularly on the nearly 20-year run of O&A, from 1994 to 2014 roughly, with some breaks in between because of multiple firings, the story that I see from the larger mosaic is that a lot of the comics were the stereotypical sad clowns. I am a fan of radio first and foremost, so while I found regular comics on O&A like Patrice O'Neill and Louis C.K. to be compelling on radio, I wasn't a fan of their stand-up, mostly because I think stand-up stinks. Artie Lang, the ex-Howard Stern sidekick, is another guy who is terrible and lazy at stand-up, but great at radio. Patrice O'Neill died at 41 years old of a stroke because of underlying health conditions. Artie Lang is somehow still alive, albeit with a caved-in nose from snorting a truckload of street drugs. Now Artie looks like a gutter punk version of Beaker from the Muppets, and he lost almost everything to a crippling heroin addiction that has now been immortalized in hundreds of hours of classic Howard Stern show audio. Otto Peterson, an O&A regular, was a crack addict who died in his mid-50s due to living the peripatetic comedian's lifestyle. Otto seemed especially tortured because he was a prop comic, which is stigmatized as hacky among the high clerics who gatekeep the true form of stand-up. Otto's act was a dirty ventriloquist duo known as Otto and George, a vestige of the old vaudeville roots of stand-up. Greg Giraldo was another frequent guest and notable stand-up comic who died in his mid-40s from a drug overdose. Joe Rogan has often credited Opie and Anthony as the inspiration for how he wanted to do his podcast. O&A have had an outsized influence in that they were the proto-podcast and the progenitor too of the strong parasocial bond with their audience. The audience in O&A's case was conditioned to be a malignant one, and I see a similar pattern playing out with the fan bases of many currently popular podcasts. This is a partial list of the other fan bases I picture in my head as villagers with torches and pitchforks in an uprising against comedy podcasts. The fans of the podcast The Fighter and the Kid, TFATK as it's known, have created an entire movement at the TFATK subreddit, which now has 150,000 full-time haters who make fun of the hosts of The Fighter and the Kid, Brendan Schaub and Brian Callen, in merciless fashion. Sentient bag of turds in a hypebeast costume, Brendan Schaub appears to be quitting stand-up comedy and hanging up the spurs as one of the 1,000 warrior priest comics in the world. I've never seen a fan base bully an alleged comedian to quit before, but somehow the lapsed fans at the Fighter and the Kid subreddit have done it. Schaub does way too many podcasts, but they include The Fighter and the Kid with Brian Callen and The Golden Hour with Chris D'Elia. Both D'Elia and Callen have been accused of sexual abuse, and both had to dip out for a bit to the sex addiction funny farm until the heat died down. I've been following the TFATK anti-fan community for years, but I cannot imagine trying to drop into that subreddit now and figure out what's going on because the lore and the jargon, the inside jokes and memes are so enmeshed with years of context. The TFATK subreddit is the ultimate thing on the internet that you want to show your friends but don't know how to explain. Tom Segura and Christina P. and all of the podcasts on their network called Your Mom's House, YMH, have a similar relationship with their fan base. YMH initially had a very loyal cult following. I use the word cult advisedly. The show got massive and experienced a huge surge during the pandemic, as many other comedy and non-comedy podcasts did. Now the YMH fan base is starting to buck in a big bad way, in the words of stoner-era Kevin Smith. A year ago, there were a handful of disillusioned fans complaining that since YMH moved to Austin to be closer to Daddy Rogan, they were getting too big for their britches. Now Tom Segura is facing real backlash for releasing a poorly reviewed special and for antagonizing his fan base by calling them pores. Tom Segura also has a podcast with Bert Kreischer called Two Bears, One Cave, and that podcast, too, is experiencing some real headwinds for the first time. Burt is becoming the new comic to shit on now that he released a big budget bomb of a film called The Machine, which was based on one of his famous stand-up bits, where Burt told what I found to be an obnoxious Shaggy Dog story about being involved with the Russian mob on a school trip. Bobby Lee hosts 2 popular podcasts and has also been involved in a recent controversy. About a year ago, a clip of an alleged joke he told about raping a child in Tijuana resurfaced. Bobby Lee's long-running podcast Tiger Belly is co-hosted by Bobby and his now ex-girlfriend, Kalila Kuhn, who has become a target of a lot of ire online. A small army, mostly former Tiger Belly fans, have grown to despise Kalila for how she has, in their view, manipulated and taken advantage of Bobby. Kalila has a hate subreddit with close to 15,000 members, which has only really taken off within the last year or so. Joe Rogan has a huge subreddit with over 1 million subscribers on Reddit, which has also become much more negative over the last couple years. I remember about 5 years ago, or before Rogan was on Spotify, there was this winter subreddit called Joe Rogan 2 that gained a lot of subscribers before it was banned for whatever reason. Joe Rogan has never made me laugh, and I find it baffling how Rogan can be the most popular comedian of all time and simultaneously not able to detect a joke if it walked past him in a marching band. I've enjoyed a couple of episodes of Rogan's podcast, mostly the ones where he interviewed weird alien guys that Art Bell interviewed better 20 years ago, but Rogan's stand-up is the drizzling shits. Tim Dillon had a major fan revolt after he fired his producer in an especially greasy maneuver. I think fans often are under the impression that comics are playing a character by being huge, gaping, raw, chafed assholes, but in reality, that's who they are. I don't have a lot more to say about Tim Dillon because he's such an obvious psychopath who previously harvested humanity's grief by selling subprime mortgages. It's a real knife fight out there. Howard Stern has an entire genre dedicated to shitting on him. Stern is the king of the starfuckers, and despite the PR campaign to brand Howard as a great interviewer, he's very one-note. Everything is psychobabble about hating your father and doling out awkward compliments to his A-list guests. I think Howard deserves the hate more than anyone because of the way he has avoided being cancelled or otherwise held to account for his old, tasteless material, while so many others have been skewered for much less. Howard, a shrewd chess master and carnival barker more than an actually funny guy, began reinventing his image many years ago, I believe, because he saw which way the wind was blowing. Part 5. Food and Jeffrey Dahmer with a joke book. At the end of part 1, I asked you to think about the subject matter of notable stand-up comedy routines. I might have loaded the deck a little bit by priming you for that question by talking about the 2 Canadian academics who study psychopaths, and they're finding that psychopaths talk about immediate, non-abstract things like what they ate or drank. Even so, when I made this connection, the number of associations I had between stand-up comedy and food and drink was a geyser of different examples that spouted to mind. And a lot of the ones that I thought about were the most important and famous bits of a comedian's career. A partial list of food-based comedy bits. Nick Swartzen's career making fajita bit that Brendan Schaub stupidly tried to steal. What's the deal with airline peanuts, the Seinfeld bit. Jim Gaffigan's career making Hot Pocket bit. Greg Warren goes viral for doing a whole 12-minute set on just peanut butter jokes. Patton Oswalt's career-making KFC Famous Bowls bit. Bean Cheese, a.k.a. Brendan Schaub's entire act. Netflix compilation of 15 minutes of comedians making food funny. John Pinette's career-making bit called Around the World in 80 Buffets. Another compilation of 1 hour and 38 minutes and 11 seconds of jokes about every fast food chain. Also, there's an entire subgenre of comedy about fast food. A 40-minute compilation about the best fast food jokes by Jim Gaffigan. There's a billion other examples, and you will start seeing them everywhere now that you're aware of the connection too. It's not just a frequency illusion or Bader-Meinhof phenomenon. Stand-up comedy is focused on the immediate, the relatable, and the lowest common denominator. Either stand-up comedy itself is based on a psychotic framework, or it attracts that type of personality, or a little of both. One other vivid example of the psychopathy of comedians came to me as I was listening to old Opie and Anthony stuff on YouTube. The video was from when O.J. Simpson's book If I Did It was originally released. Louis C.K. was a guest on the show, and on the segment in question, they were reading excerpts of the chapter in If I Did It where O.J. describes murdering Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman. There's a very odd meta quality to listening to this segment while writing this because Louis C.K. and the guys on the radio show engage in an interesting linguistic deconstruction and analysis of the writing in O.J.'s book and how vivid the description of the murder was in text. Anthony and Louis C.K. get into a riff about how the only people who can authentically describe the scene of a murder and the subtleties of things that you would feel in that blood rage are great fiction writers and people who actually murdered someone. O.J. Simpson was either a great novelist in disguise as a Heisman Trophy-winning running back, or he actually killed his ex-wife and Ron Goldman. This only further reinforced my convictions about the dark pathology of comedians. It has something to do with control. In comedians, it seems to present itself in baffling paraphilias, like Louis C.K. wanting women to watch him masturbate, a captive audience, or Bill Cosby wanting to incapacitate women and then use them like a sex doll, the ultimate captive audience. At 30 minutes, 26 seconds into the clip I was listening to with Louis C.K. on the Opie and Anthony show about O.J., Louis C.K. told a story about what having sex on the road was like as a working comic. Louis said that this was a running discussion he had been having with Nick DiPaolo, another stand-up comedian who came up with Louis in the 1980s Boston comedy scene. The way that Louis described sexual intimacy seemed to be uniquely cynical and dark. I thought back to the strong association with psychopaths using primary sense language that we discussed at the beginning of this bizarre journey into the psyche of stand-up comedy. Hungry like the wolf. Here's what Louis said about how he remembers sexual encounters doing road gigs as a comic.
That's what, like, me and Nick DiPaolo were talking about sex on the road, when you're on the road doing stand-up and when you meet somebody and have sex with them. The moment that we describe, the juicy moment that is the best part, is that metallic sound of the hotel room door clicking closed when she leaves. Like the tink, and you're like, yes! Room service, TV, shower.
Mission accomplished.
Yes, get her out!
I've rarely found stand-up compelling as an art form. I've known for a long time that it wasn't my cup of tea because I'm an introvert and I'm especially susceptible to secondhand embarrassment. I have trouble watching cringy content, and there's something cringy to me about many aspects of stand-up comedy. The entire idea of being a captive audience to this routine that somebody does is grating to me. Even the words used to describe it, a routine, as in something that has become commonplace. Something that you program into yourself by repeating and practicing a speech to no one in particular, that you then recite on stage in front of others as if it was all just occurring to you in a stream of consciousness. It's an inherently dishonest medium, and the medium is the message. The message of stand-up comedy is that you should sit and laugh in sync with the places in the routine where there is a natural pause, when the comedian has scheduled your applause or your laughter or your assumed input. Stand-up comedy to me is Bill Cosby doing silly faces, a direct descendant of the minstrel tradition of exaggerated expressions of the blackface mask. It's Bill Cosby selling pudding pops and Jell-O. There's something pleasant and outwardly amusing and arresting about the imagery and the messaging, but the true nature of the thing is monstrous. Stand-up comedy is a unique interplay between the individual and the group, where the worst instincts of both are encouraged.